know, you mentioned that, and Dr. Peterson, you mentioned white privilege, and one of the things that really has concerned me quite a bit as a student of philosophy and history is this concerted effort now. I know Columbia University is doing this, where they want to remove Shakespeare and Chaucer and other writers because they said it's triggering students, and we need to have more diversity and anti-colonial perspective. These are the greatest thinkers in world history, the greatest artists, the greatest philosophers. I've had colleagues get upset at me to my face and tell me when during my break I read Socrates or something that that's offensive, that he didn't believe women had the right to vote, he never stood up for the rights of the slaves, they didn't want to go to museums, they didn't want to go to art exhibits, they said they were triggered. So nobody has achieved so much advancement as Western civilization. Nobody can deny this, it is a fact in science, arts, literature, math. And the whole of humanity has benefited from this, every single culture and country. Yet, when this is brought up in classrooms, like students have just approached me in the break, saying they're targeted just for their race of being white. And if you are a white man, straight, cis, you are the #1 target in humanities and liberal colleges across the board. Yet, everyone is using their inventions, like every single nation and professor. So, thoughts on that?
Well, I just think it's another manifestation of exactly the same thing. I mean, these ideologies, I've described it as, and not only me, obviously, as postmodern neo-Marxism, they're answer-generating heuristics. This is something Solzhenitsyn detailed extraordinarily well in the Gulag Archipelago about, you know, if you're possessed by an ideology, learn about 10 rules, and then you can just crank the crank, and the rules will produce speech acts, right? They'll produce words, and once you accept the fact that everything that you don't like about life is a consequence of the patriarchy, and you add Eurocentric and phallocentric to that, maybe toss in a bit of race, then you have an answer for every question. And you know, it's a very fragile system in some sense. You know, we talked about people being triggered. That ideology is so full of performative contradictions that it's very fragile. Performative contradiction occurs when you act out something that runs contrary to your stated beliefs. So, for example, you might claim that mathematics is a tool of white supremacy, but use your iPad. That's a performative contradiction because one of those things doesn't go with the other. And that's an indication of the fragility of your belief system. And so, when your beliefs, one of the things your belief systems do is regulate your emotions. They do a lot more than that, but they definitely regulate your emotions. And so the people who are putting forth these ideologies really are fragile in their cognitive structures, and they really do respond very badly to having their axioms challenged, as do many people, by the way. But it's part and parcel of the same thing. It's all generated by the same limited set of axioms.
But is this group so large in numbers that they can have this level of influence where they want to remove Shakespeare and Blake and Milton and...
They don't have to have numbers, they just have to be noisy. Like, really, like, the views that most of you share are undoubtedly the views of the vast majority of people in the Western world, you know, essentially. But a tiny, noisy minority that's well-funded and well-organized, and the radical leftists on the college campuses qualify on both counts. They're subsidized. This is one of the amazing things, is they're subsidized by taxpayers and by the people who pay tuition for their kids. They do nothing but organize and agitate and train new organizers and agitators. Those of you who own businesses, you better beware of your human resources people, because that's the pathway by which all of these pathological ideas are moving into the corporate sphere. And if you think that the HR people who are pushing diversity, equity, and inclusivity on you are pro-capitalist, you've got another thing coming. And so I have absolutely no idea why you would encourage the invasion of a fifth column into your enterprise. I guess it's to, you know, trumpet your social justice, what would you call it, qualifications, but it's an extraordinarily bad medium to long-term decision. So it's a noisy minority, but don't underestimate the power of a well-organized, noisy minority, especially when they can target individuals and shut them down, because then the individuals never get to discover that, hey, well, we're actually in the majority here. Like I would say it's probably 20 to 1. It might even be 50 to 1.
Right.
So, but it just doesn't take that much.
I think the way I would analogize the small number, the noisy minority, is think about terrorists. They constitute a very small number of all living human beings. Yet most of us will waste a substantial amount of our lives going through security protocols at airports because of that small, noisy minority. And so in the same way that terrorists are attacking our sense of safety, but they constitute a small minority, these progressive types, I've referred to them. Someone said, oh, but that's such a mean term, they were offended. They are intellectual terrorists, right? Instead of making us fearful when we get on a flight, if this is going to be our last flight, they make us fearful to walk into a classroom and speak our mind, lest the thought police. And so no, they're not a small minority. It takes very few people to terrorize many of us, and so they're doing a very good job.
And Dr. Saad said intellectual terrorists, and you think, yeah, it's kind of, that's a bit hard on the rhetoric, let's say. But that's not right. It's not harsh rhetoric at all. I was reading this chapter yesterday by a guy named Mark Lilla, who wrote a recent book. The name will come to me in a moment. But there was a chapter on Foucault in there, and I hadn't remembered Foucault for a while. I read a bunch of his books like 20 years ago. And he had a quote in there, Lilla, from Foucault in the late 60s, if I remember correctly. And he basically said, and I'm paraphrasing, but if the oppressed overthrew the oppressors, he might have used bourgeoisie and or proletariat and bourgeoisie at that point in his writing, but it doesn't matter. It's if the oppressed overthrew the oppressor, and the consequence of that was the mass death, painful death of the oppressors, then that would be a perfectly acceptable price to pay. Now, I don't know how you could write that in the late 60s. I don't know how you could be that blind and malevolent. Like everyone knew by the 1960s, who had their eyes open the least amount. They knew what had happened in the Soviet Union. Malcolm Muggeridge told the West in the 1920s. George Orwell, who was a socialist, informed everybody in the 19th knew that system was pathological beyond belief, and yet Foucault, who's the darling of the left, the radical left, could come out and say, well, you know, it's just a few corpses. Like, and they won't be mine. They won't be my corpse, which is really the critical thing. So that's a small, you can't make an omelet, you know, without breaking a few eggs, right? So to call them intellectual terrorists, to call Derrida an intellectual terrorist, to call Foucault an intellectual terrorist is exactly right. They hated each other, by the way, which is quite interesting. But their thinking tangles together very nicely. They wanted to flip everything upside down. So,
Dr. Amitay?
When I hear this, the one thing I keep going back to, and this is part of the impetus for my speech, was this idea of personal accountability. And everything that's going on here, it robs people of this personal accountability. And earlier we asked what can we do about this. Parents from the child's young age have to instill in the sense of A, personal accountability, and B, not be afraid to make mistakes, to take risks, to fail, and then get up and and learn from that. And I'm seeing, again, as a parenting expert, I'm seeing way too many parents kind of abdicating that responsibility because they're too busy double careers or putting whatever the case may be, but they're not investing the time in helping the children have that strong sense of, again, personal responsibility or accountability. There has to be a consequence to your actions, and you can't just say, well, if I screwed up, it's because of the patriarchy. You have to say, I didn't do my job right.
Dr. Amitay, even if parents do everything they can, what about when the children are in school? Because like I was saying, the most frantic emails I'm getting, like frantic, are teachers. So they feel very powerless. So the kids are going to be spending 6 to 7 hours a day in a classroom, and they are being indoctrinated, for lack of a better word. So when they do go home, the parents might be giving them all that, but then on Twitter and Facebook, in the classroom, in the textbooks now, that Kathleen Wynne had mentioned, she wants to remove the word mother and father and replace it with primary caregiver or parent. Because mother and father is not inclusive, never mind the fact that all humans are born through mother and father, and we've been using this word.
Or that biological essentialism.
Yeah, and the fact that, you know, billions of people on this planet say mother and father, billions, and this is something that she's saying needs to be eradicated in schools. So I want to get Dr. Amitay, first you to comment on that, since you brought up the parenting issue, and then Dr. Peterson and Dr. Saad as well.
Yeah, well, as hard as it is, these parents have to stand up. And as Dr. Peterson was saying, if the children are being taught something, how do the parents know that? They have to be more involved. They've got to get involved with what the curriculum happens to be. Meet the teacher, ask the right questions. You can't let this go unchecked. And I know, because I've counseled a lot of parents in similar situations, if they push back really hard, you know, and they make their voice known, teachers will back down a little bit because they don't want a problematic parent. So it's really up to the parents to do that, A, with the school staff, and B, with their children. No matter how much, the parents have to put these children, they have to put an asbestos suit on these children so that they're not, you know, poisoned or by these toxic ideas.
Right.
It's the parents' job. It starts with them.
Dr. Peterson?
Well, this is not subtle either. Like in Ontario, well, we have social justice tribunals, right, which is a phrase that should send a chill down anyone's heart. And the reason I'm using that example is because the social justice types have become so brazen, I would say, that they don't even hide their terminology anymore. It's like social justice tribunals. They're quasi-court systems, and beware if you ever get tangled up in one. But the same thing's happening with the elementary school curriculum. It's being transformed into a social justice curriculum. It's a lot easier to teach that tripe than it is to actually educate people, because you only have to teach them 10 things, and then they can repeat them, you know, and you've done your job, and you're morally virtuous. It's way more difficult to teach kids how to read or do mathematics. But, you know, we're at a point in Canada, weirdly enough, where the philosophical stability that we've taken for granted, that has made this country such a stable and welcoming place, is really under assault. And Wynne's a good example. Hypothetically, she leads the centrist Liberals. Liberals are always occupying the center in Canadian history, right? They move a little left and then they move a little right, and you could be cynical about that, but you shouldn't be, because they're tracking the population. But now, like, my estimation is that Wynne is far left of the Democratic Socialist Party I knew as the NDP back in the 1970s. But she's operating under the rubric of the Liberals, and no one. I mean, she's not popular, right? I think she's at 10%. And she should resign. If she had an ounce of integrity. In a parliamentary system, when your popularity goes down to 20%, you resign. That's what you do. But the parliamentary system is just part of the evil patriarchy anyway, so you don't have to... Yeah, well, I'm serious about that. It's perfect justification. Why should you pay any attention to the evil patriarchy? So, but the fact of the matter is that the educational faculties are producing ideologues who are indoctrinating children as young as possible into the cause of social justice. That's what's happening. And if you don't believe it, then just go look online. Go look at the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. Just go look at their website. It's not like they're hiding it. Most of the time, people don't hide what they're doing. They just tell you, and you think, no, they're not doing that. It's like, yeah, they are. That's why they're telling you that, is they're actually doing it. So,
surprise.
If I could just set up a theory and then see how we could apply it to what you could all do. So some of you may or may not have heard of this collective goods dilemma called the tragedy of the commons. It was sort of repopularized by an ecologist by the name of Harding. And so let me just kind of explain it very briefly and then link it to the problem that we're facing. So the tragedy of the commons, let's say you have 10 farmers, each of whom has some livestock that he uses. They graze on a common land. Now the land needs to rest for a year or 2 years so that it can recover. So they come to a gentleman's agreement where they say, okay, we each promise that we will not let our livestock go on this land. But what they end up doing is each says, how about if I violate the tenant, hoping that all of the other folks will be honorable and not violated? Well, that's the perfect situation. I can still have my livestock feed, and the other ones are all honorable, and therefore the land will recover. The tragedy of the commons is that they all think that, and therefore it doesn't get resolved. Now, how do we link that to the social justice warrior problem that we're talking about? Well, everybody, not everybody in this room, but most people think, well, let Peterson and let Saad do the honorable thing. I'm busy, I need to buy my tomatoes for tonight's dinner. I've got my daughter's graduating ceremony tomorrow. I've got the busy exam. There are other folks who will be honorable and do the right thing, while I can renege on my responsibility. And so what I implore each of you to do is to not fall prey to the tragedy of the commons. You all have a word that can be used, and if everybody stands up in unison and fights these very bad ideas, then they could be a little bleep in our rearview mirror. But if we keep expecting a few people to carry all of the burden, then we could potentially lose the battle.
I just want to expand on that a little bit. One of the things that people do when they write me is to say that watching my videos have provided them with the words that they need to express certain ideas. You know, ideas are kind of strange because they often begin with embodied sensations, emotions. You know, you come home after work, you're annoyed, maybe you have a fight with your partner, your wife or your husband, to use the biological essentialist terms. And, you know, the fight goes kind of sideways, and it isn't until you're 20 minutes into it that you really realize what was annoying you. Maybe it was something at work. So the idea is first manifested as an unpleasant emotion. You don't even know what the damn idea is, and then you kind of have to stumble around stupidly while you're torturing your spouse, trying to figure out what the hell's wrong with you. You know, the point I'm making here is that it's not easy to engage in abstract philosophical arguments, and if you're up against the postmodernist ideologues, they'll outword you pretty damn rapidly unless you have thought these things through to a great degree. But you don't have to, you know. You can, it's good to use precise language, but you can say, look, there's something about what's happening here that really strikes me the wrong way. I don't know what it is, but I oppose it. And if you're pushed, you know, if you're pushed, you can say, well, look, I don't have the language to lay out my counter-argument at the moment, but it's violating my sense of right and wrong, something like that. And at least then you've signaled, I'm not saying that's good enough. Those are just feelings. They aren't good enough, but they're better than nothing. And at least then you can signal the fact that you're not operating in full compliance with the agenda. And, you know, there's a famous experiment by a guy named Solomon Asch. He showed people 2 lines on the blackboard, one of which was obviously slightly longer than the other, but obviously, so that everyone could tell. And then he had all the Confederates in the class, so the audience, pretend that they were the same size, and there were, you know, a few experimental subjects sprinkled in there who didn't know that the whole audience had been set up. And so he would ask people whether the lines were the same or different, and they would say that they were the same. And then he would go to the people who were not in on the secret and ask them, and they would almost invariably say that they were the same. But if one person said that they were different, then all of them would say that they were different. So that's all it takes. It takes one person to sort of stand up and say, even in an awkward manner, look, I'm not happy with what's going on here. And then other people who, there's more than you that think that way. It's almost always the case, you know, unless there's something spectacularly peculiar about you. And there probably is. So, but don't assume that you have to be perfect at this before you do it, because you have to stumble around like an idiot when you're engaged in these sorts of struggles, let's say, because it's difficult and complicated, and you're not going to get good at it unless you practice. And when you first start, you're going to be bad. It's going to be embarrassing. You know, you're going to say things that aren't even correct while you stumble around. But it's part of sharpening yourself up, and it's really useful. It's really useful to sharpen yourself up like that. So you can have some reliance on your own sense of propriety, especially if you discuss it with a couple of people around you too, you know, because that helps kind of keep you in check. Your brother, your sister, your kids, your husband or wife. You can prepare that way, but don't be thinking that you have to be a genius to do this, because, well, if that's the case, then we're in real trouble.
So I'm going to interject here and say that we've reached the last question, and then we'll have the question answered. And so the last question is a bit of a two-part. One is, I know, Dr. Peterson, you mentioned that the fact that so many people are here, I mean, the underlying reason is not something we should feel good about, but does this give you hope, seeing the demand for this and 1,500 people sold out, that people are very concerned about this issue? They want to hear a dialogue around it, they want to hear solutions around it. Is there a reason for us to be hopeful tonight, given the large turnout? And this is a question for the three of you.
Well, I think we're in a true transition period. I think that things could go spectacularly badly or spectacularly well. It's a lot easier for things to go spectacularly badly. I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic, I would say, because I really don't believe, I believe that things are so uncertain that looking into the future with any degree of length is not useful. And maybe this is just a consequence of my own personal situation, but I've been really playing it day by day. Sometimes I'm hopeful, sometimes I'm less hopeful, but regardless, I believe that the truth prevails. And the reason I believe that is because the truth is related to reality. That's what makes it the truth. And reality prevails. And so I'm hopeful in that sense. The question is whether or not people will allow themselves to align with their own truth to the degree that makes their adaptation to reality possible. We'll see. It's a decision that everybody's making all the time.
Well, first, I take issue with the use of the word truth, and I'd like to have a 3-hour discussion with you on that. But look, the point of my 3-hour talk really came down to what can each and every person do to help lean toward the side of a positive outcome. And I agree with what Dr. Peterson saying, you can go one way or the other. Hoping, like coming here and showing support is great, but it's doing the small things, the daily things that just can kind of encourage somebody else to do a little bit more, and encourage somebody else to do a little bit more. So as long as you're acting in that manner, then we have a chance. And this is, to me, this is a great sign. I'm really glad that there's so many people here, and I just hope that every single person goes out there inspired to try to make at least a little bit of change. Then we have hope.
Okay. Dr. Saad, are you hopeful?
I am, if each person in the room commits to, I don't know what the metric should be, but commit to getting engaged in some meaningful way X number of times over the next Y period, right? I mean, one of the ways that we affect change is not to say, I'd like to lose weight next year, but rather to say, if I go on a all-inclusive vacation, I will never have more than one plate at the buffet, right? So the details matter in being able to implement something. Vagueness is the enemy of achieving the goal. So what I would implore you to do is, well, first I would say thank you for all coming here, because it certainly gives us great solace to know that there are many people who support the cause, so thank you for that. But I would say that that's insufficient. The next step is for each of you to commit in a very concrete way to doing 1, 2, 3 actions a week, a month, a day to support the cause, and then we will reverse this trend and we will win the battle, I think.
I could tell you one thing you can do, and you could write to Andrew Scheer and tell him not to be afraid of being conservative, because you could do the same to Patrick Brown. And I don't care if you support the Conservatives or not. That's not the point. I know for a fact that they're terrified of being Conservatives. They won't speak up. And the reason for that is, well, they're worried about being singled out and targeted one by one as bigots and transphobes. You know the whole language. They're really worried about that. And so, as far as I'm concerned, they're basically defeated before they get off the ground, because they've lost if that's the case. But I don't care if you think that the Conservatives are wrong. That's not the point. We need the distribution of viewpoints, and we need a healthy dialogue between them. It's absolutely necessary. If the Conservatives are now afraid of being conservative, then we've lost one of our oars, and we're going to, row around in circles, to use a rather trite metaphor. But I'm telling you, I've talked to lots of them, and they're so afraid that they won't have me come and speak to them, generally speaking, not in public, because they're afraid of being associated with me. And well, Gad said the same thing about his colleagues. I mean, so that means despite the fact that they agree with me, right, most of them, or a proportion of them, they're worried about being associated with me in the public eye. And the reason that they're worried about that is because they are afraid. And that's a bad thing. I don't ever remember that being the case in the Canada that I have known since I was a tiny child. It's a bad thing. So.
I have a very good friend here tonight, and I'm not going to name her, but because she's still in the field of social work and she's in a very prominent position, and even though I'd love to thank her and she's helped me a lot today, I worry just saying her name and her being associated with me when she goes back to work on Monday, what that would mean for her. So I'm not even going to look in her direction and say her name. So that's very sad. And I said this was a two-part question, so my second part of this, and this is the final question, what person right now in modern times can you think of that you really admire who is standing up for free speech, other than yourself and the co-panelists? What other name could you put out there so that the audience, if they want to read up on them, read their books, or look up their YouTube videos, they can? So if each of you could give a name. I'd like to give one, Ben Shapiro. And I can't say your name, although you're all in there, because I said it can't be anyone here.
I'm pretty impressed with Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah. Dr. Saad?
Rather than listing someone famous whose name you would all know, here's who I'm going to thank. It's going to be a collective sort of shout out. All the people who currently live in non-free societies, who truly know what it is to live under totalitarian ideologies.
Yes.
And like the place I come from, who dare speak out, and I've had some of those people on my show. I recently had a Jordanian guy who was catapulted to fame out of nowhere because he started the atheist organization in Jordan. Well, that's what takes courage, is to be able to take these positions, not at Brown University in Castrato land, but it's to be able to speak openly and defend your convictions in lands where doing so will cause you to have your head detached from the rest of your body. And so my admiration goes to all the people in these non-free societies who are in the front line of fighting for freedom.
Second strike against me. First, because you took Ben Shapiro.
Yeah, I know
and second, because my answer now is juxtaposed against Gad's. It's going to sound really bad. But it's going to sound strange, but you know what? Someone that I think has been very influential in spreading ideas and getting people to talk and you know, ignoring left and right and this and that, Joe Rogan.
Can I add to this? So as some of you may know, Joe's a good friend of mine, and I've been on the show many, many times. And I'm absolutely amazed at the influence that this guy has. There isn't a place I can walk where someone won't come up to me and say, oh, I loved your Joe Rogan show XYZ. This guy has more influence than probably CNN, NBC, and CBS put together. And by the way, that speaks to a point that we've all discussed. He came out of nowhere, right? He's a stand-up comic, he's an actor, but he's an open person. He's a person who just likes to sit down and discuss ideas. And through that conviction and through that intellectual curiosity, he's built a platform that is simply remarkable. And so, hats off to Joe Rogan.
Joe gets 120 million downloads a month, right? 1.5 billion a year.
Wow.
Right, so he's probably the most powerful interviewer who's ever lived. So, yeah, it's really something. I asked him about that. He said he tries not to think about it.
So I think we're going to move to the... Sorry?
Yeah, so people are pretty happy about Camille Pelley as well. So, yeah.